Hey everyone, this is going to be a quick review for your Chapter 11 test. The first one we're going to do is solve using the zero product property. Well, the zero product property just says if I have two things and I multiply them together and get 0, I know that one of those things has to be 0. Either the cloud is 0 or the balloon equals 0. So over for this problem, here's my cloud, here's my balloon. So if I have a product equal to 0, either x plus 12 equals 0 or x minus 8 equals 0. So I get two equations that I can easily solve. I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides and get x equals negative 12. Or over here I'm going to add 8 to both sides and I'm going to get x equals 8. So there's my solution. This next one says to solve by factoring, which is going to use that zero product property again. So I first need to make sure that I've got everything on the left side and there's nothing here but a 0. So if you have a number over here, make sure you add or subtract to get it onto the right. I'm going to factor and I get x and x, and I need two numbers that multiply to give me negative 24 and add to give me a positive 5. And those numbers are going to be plus 8 and a minus 3. Now again, as in the last example, here's my cloud and here's my balloon. When I multiply two things and get 0, either the first one equals 0 or the second one equals 0. So for this one, I'm going to subtract 8 from both sides, and I get x equals negative 8, or I'm going to add 3 to both sides to this equation, and I get x equals a positive 3, and that's my solution. Next, solve by taking square roots. Well, if you are solving an equation and there's no x term and you've just either got an x squared term, or the equation might look something like this. Maybe you had like 3 times the quantity x plus 7 squared, and then maybe it equals 27 or something. Regardless of what you see, if your x is squared, or if your x is embedded in something that's squared, you've got to undo the square by square roots. But before you do that, you want to get rid of anything that's around that squared quantity. So the first thing we are going to want to do is divide by 3, because then I have x squared equals 25. The next step is to undo the square by taking the square root of both sides. And this is super important. Make sure you put in the plus or minus when you take the square root of both sides. Then I have x equals plus or minus 5. If you want to write it out, you can say x equals 5 or x equals negative 5. Now I'm going to finish this one over here to the right just so that you can see how that one works out as well. I'm going to divide by 3, and I get x plus 7, quantity squared, equals 9. When I take the square root of both sides, I am going to remember my plus or minus, and I get x plus 7 because the square and the square root undo each other, so all that's left is what was underneath. And then on the right side, I get plus or minus 3. All right, now to finish this problem, I need to subtract 7 from both sides. When I do that, I like to write the number that is here. I like to write that first so that the plus or minus goes in the middle. So in order to make that happen, I'm going to write the minus 7 and then the plus or minus 3. So to finish it, I would say x equals negative 7 plus 3, which is negative 4, or negative 7 minus 3, which is negative 10. Okay, the next problem is solve by completing the square. And the very first thing that I'm going to notice here is that this number is not a 1. If there's a number there other than 1, you've got to divide it out. So I'm going to start out by dividing all the way through by 2. That's going to leave me with x squared minus 6x minus 55 equals 0. Now when we solve by completing the square, we do not want to have this number chosen for us. We want to choose that. So I'm going to need to get rid of that. So I'm going to add 55 to both sides. When I do that, I end up with x squared minus 6x, and then on the right side I have my 55. Now I'm going to choose what goes in this blank so that I get a perfect square. Now if I do a plus blank on one side, I have to do the same thing on the other side to keep my equation balanced. Now to figure out what goes in the blank, I'm going to take half of this number and square it. So half of -6 is -3, and when I square -3, I get 9. This number will always be positive because we're squaring something. All right, now I'm going to factor the left side, and that's going to be x minus 3, x minus 3, or x minus 3 quantity squared. And on the right side, I get 64. Now I'm going to do what I did in that last problem. I'm going to undo the square with a square root, remembering my plus or minus. Then I get x minus 3 equals plus or minus 8. To finish this problem, I need to add 3 to both sides. And I'm going to write it as x equals a positive 3 plus or minus 8. So x equals 3 plus 8, which is 11, or 3 minus 8, which is a -5. The other type of problem is solved by the quadratic formula. And before you can do anything with the quadratic formula, you need to make sure all the numbers are on the left and you have 0 on the right. So for this problem, I'm going to need to subtract 5 from both sides. So I'm going to have 3x squared plus 4x minus 5 equals 0. Now I can write down what a, b, and c are. A is 3, b is 4, and c is -5. Don't forget the number that, or the sign that's in front of the number. Now the quadratic formula is x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. So I just need to put my numbers in. So the opposite of b, the opposite of 4 is -4 plus or minus the square root of b squared, 4 squared is 16, minus 4 times a times c all over 2 times a. Now you need to notice here when I'm subtracting here, I've got 2 negatives, so I'm actually going to be adding a number there. So as I continue, I've got x equals -4 plus or minus the square root of 16 plus 60 all over 6. So that's -4 plus or minus the square root of 76 all over 6. All right, as we keep going, we're going to have to go over to the side and figure out what the square root of 76 simplifies to. So it's even, so I'm going to say the square root of 2 times the square root of 38. So this one's done. This would be the square root of 2 times the square root of 19. So it looks like I've got buddies here. So they come out as a 2. And I've got x equals -4 plus or minus 2 radical 19 all over 6. Now, if you notice that there is a common factor of all 3 of these numbers, then you can simplify. And since there are, I'm going to say 2 goes in here 3 times, 2 goes in here 1 time, 2 goes in here twice. And don't forget that minus sign, so I'm going to stick that right up there in front of the 2 so that I don't forget it. So I get x equals -2 plus or minus 1 radical 19 all over 3. And that's my final answer. So on the test, I will have you solve equations by factoring, completing the square, taking square roots, and the quadratic formula, but there will also be problems that just say, solve the quadratic equation. If that's the case, then you can choose. If there is no x term, then I would probably suggest that you take square roots. But if there is a full quadratic equation that has an x squared term, an x term, and a constant, then I would say my first recommendation is to try and see if it's one that will factor quickly. If it's not one that will factor quickly, then I would jump to the quadratic formula. My last choice would be to solve by completing the square. Okay, so now let's look at solving a radical equation. This is a radical equation because it has a radical in it. It might have one radical, it might have two, but for this one I've got one radical and it's on the left. And the way that we undo radicals is we square. So I'm going to square both sides. Now be careful on the right because I often have people tell me that this is x squared plus 49 and it is not. If you square a binomial, you have to write it down twice and use FOIL. So let's do that. On the left, when I square the square root, I just get x plus 13. On the right, I need to write this down twice and use FOIL. So my answer so far is going to be x plus 13 equals x squared plus 14x plus 49. Now I need to get everything on one side, and since I already have a positive x squared, I don't want to move that to the left. I'm going to move everything over to the right. So I'm going to subtract 13, which is going to give me this, and then I'm going to subtract the x. So my equation is going to be 0 equals x squared plus 13x plus 36. Okay, now I prefer to have this written on the other side, so I can switch those around and put the 0 on the right. So now I'm going to factor it. I can solve this however I want, but as I said before, if I have my choice, I'm going to see if I can quickly factor it. And this is one where I can say what two numbers multiply to give me 36 and add to give me 13, and that would be a plus 4 and a plus 9. So I'm going to say x plus 4 equals 0, or x plus 9 equals 0. So when I solve these, I'm going to subtract 4 on both sides and get x equals negative 4, or I'm going to subtract 9 on both sides and I'm going to get x equals negative 9. Now before you circle those and move on, you need to remember that when we square both sides, sometimes we introduce extraneous solutions, so we do need to check these. So I'm going to move this over just a little bit so I've got some room. First I'm going to check x equals negative 4. So what that means is I need to take my original problem, which was this, and I need to put a negative 4 in for x. So I'm going to put a negative 4 in here. The rest stays the same. And then on the other side, I'm going to put a negative 4 in for the x again. And I'm going to see if the left side works out to the same as the right side. On the left side, negative 4 plus 13 is 9. And on the right side, negative 4 plus 7 is 3. Square root of 9 is 3. So it looks like x minus 4 is indeed a solution. Okay, let's check the other one. So let's check x equals negative 9. I'm going to put a negative 9 in here for the x. And on the other side, I'm going to do the same thing and see what we get. On the left side, I get the square root of 4, and on the right side, I get a negative 2. Well, the square root of 4 is 2, but 2 does not equal negative 2, so that one does not check. So I'm going to come over here and cross this one out, and this guy here is my only solution. So that's basically the review for the test. I will tell you that there are a couple word problems, and there are a couple questions on what you see here. First of all, remember the Pythagorean theorem, leg squared plus leg squared equals hypotenuse squared. You should know that for the rest of your life. Now these here, I'm going to have a couple questions that have to do with understanding what happens depending on the number under the radical. So if the number under the radical is positive, you're going to get two solutions. You're going to get the 3 plus that number and the 3 minus that number. And kind of as a bonus, if this is a perfect square, then you're going to get 3 plus or minus 2 over 7, and there are no more radicals. So if this guy is a perfect square, you're going to get rational solutions. If that guy is not a perfect square, then you're going to get a radical in your answer, and then it would be irrational. Okay, moving on. If the number under the radical is 0, look what happens to our answer. We get 8 plus or minus 0 over 2. Well, that's just the same as 8 over 2, which is 4. So I end up with one solution, and there's no radical there, so it's rational. And then the third option is getting a negative under the radical, and we do not take square roots of negative numbers. So I would stop working that equation, and I would say that there are no real solutions. When you get to Algebra 2, we will learn about some alternative ways to deal with a problem like this, but for your purposes, there's no solution if you get a negative under the radical. Okay, there you go. I hope you do well on your test, and we will see you at our next class.